I think the first thing we're going to do is look at a clip back-to-back of each of these three films from these filmmakers, and then we'll get to talking.
In an earlier life, Inda Ade had been America's enemy, offering protection to people on the U.S. kill list. But the warlord had since changed sides. He was now on the U.S. payroll and assumed the title of general.
So he's saying that the fiercest fighting that they're doing right now is happening right here.
Okay. The men fired across the rooftops, but it didn't make sense to me what we were doing here, or what the Americans were doing here, in Somalia, arming this warlord turned general for what seemed like a senseless war.
We gotta move with them, man. So these were Shabab fighters you buried here? If you capture a foreigner alive, you execute them on the battlefield?
Yeah, sure. You have to kill them.
In my work as a photographer or filmmaker, I always look to be as close to the subject as possible. You're always looking for those moments when the machine breaks down, where there's cracks in it. And I think what happened to us in terms of being given access into this remote valley in Afghanistan was that people kind of forgot about us. And I think it was that persistence of going back and back that gave us such unique access.
Hey guys, how you doing? You know, perfect day for a stroll.
When Tim and I got into the Korangal Valley, the things that soldiers evaluate are you going to cause a problem? Are you going to freak out during combat and need to be taken care of? And finally, are you going to be sort of nasty and political about all this? And Tim and I were clearly not doing that.
All right, listen up. Today we're going to conduct a movement of contact into the village of Obanel. All right, got 11 U.S. personnel, 5 ANA, 1 Terp, and Sebastian and Tim. Does anyone have any questions? Let's go.
I joined the military halfway through my senior year of high school, wanting to serve my country.
The Coast Guard said that they could get me in within a month, so ship me off. I loved that I could keep up with the guys and work as hard as they did.
The professionalism, the camaraderie. Getting out there and giving it my all.
That's what I chose to do. Everything changed the day that I was raped.
I've never seen trauma like I've seen from veterans who have suffered military sexual trauma.
This goes everywhere with me. You always have protection with Jesus, but sometimes you need just a little bit more.
Most Americans assume there is access to a system of justice.
You'd see a guy get 5 years for drugs and 2 weeks for rape.
They let this man get away with everything but murder. They gave him Military Professional of the Year award during the rape investigation.
It was a laughing matter.
He says, "You're the 3rd girl to report rape this week. You guys like all in cahoots? You think this is a game?"
About 500,000 women have now been sexually assaulted in the U.S. military.
Civilians see it as being a military problem.
Anybody can be a victim of sexual assault.
Rapists are repetitive criminals.
Why would they stop?
They go on to literally prey on women and men, girls and boys in our neighborhoods back home.
It's very difficult to do a story on the most powerful institution in the world.
The Department of Defense has a history of covering up sexual offense problems. I don't know who you think elected you to defy the Congress of the United States. What is it you're trying to hide?
So before I put out the first question, I just want to say a sentence at least about Rick and Sebastian's film, since Kirby's is a trailer for the film, so I think you get, if you haven't seen Invisible War, you get a clear idea about its subject matter, about dealing with the whole issue of rape in the military. Very provocative, hard-hitting film. Rick's film, I'll try to summarize you if I get it wrong, but he basically has created a documentary thriller where he follows this journalist, Jeremy Scahill, who writes for The Nation, among other places. And Jeremy is trying to figure out what's happening with all these covert special forces operations that are involving people being killed, including women and children, and not even in just places like Afghanistan and Iraq, but other countries. And he's sort of on this hunt to try to figure out what's going on, why it's going on, and get to the bottom of it. And your film follows that journey. Is that?
Yeah, that's great.
And then Sebastian's film, he made Restrepo with Tim Heatherton, great film. And then this film, Tim Heatherton was killed in Libya, and Sebastian's film is both, I think, a portrait of Tim and who he was as a person and as a photojournalist and documentary filmmaker. But it's also, I think, very much a rumination on how you do this work, whether it's filmmaking or photography, and a rumination on the impact of war on journalists. Is that?
Yep.
And so one of the things, the sort of headliner topic for this is that we talk about navigating the sort of military command when you're a filmmaker, journalist, and trying to tell story. And so whether you're embedded or not. And so I think the first question, I just want each of you guys to speak, briefly on, in your particular cases, and with Sebastian, with you, it may be more about Restrepo for this question, I think, than this film. But, what were the challenges, or did you even avoid those challenges of trying to navigate a relationship with or around the military, the Pentagon, the people in command? I want to start with you, Rick.
Yeah. Well, media has always been part of military strategy forever. But it has never been so tightly incorporated into war planning as it was, beginning with the Iraq War and rolling on through the evolving conflict in Afghanistan and beyond. I mean, the amount of the way that embedded reporters are incorporated into units and the access that's given to people from all over the place, so that like a local television reporter from Cleveland can go and embed with the Marines in Marja and get access to things that would have been difficult in other times. But operating outside of that embedded process has become, is incredibly dangerous and difficult now. I mean, if you go unilateral in Iraq, all bets are off. And in fact, there were moments in Iraq where the U.S. military basically said that we're gonna treat. Like in Fallujah in 2004, we're going to treat unilateral reporters as combatants, essentially, in certain places. So, and if you just see, with the Iraq invasion, media became targets if they were the wrong kind of media. I mean, Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya were bombed, as the tanks were rolling into Baghdad, were taken out as military targets because the images that they were circulating were seen as a strategic military, fact. The Al Jazeera reporters who were in Fallujah were also targeted because they were reporting, images and pictures and things that the U.S. military said some of them were not true or were exaggerations or whatever, but were seen as a military liability there. So, I've filmed a lot in Iraq and Afghanistan, embedded and unembedded, and it's absolutely invaluable to be embedded with troops. I mean, you're allowed to see. And what Sebastian's film shows, Restrepo showed so brilliantly was, and intimately, was the lives and the real lived experience of these soldiers in an environment that is sometimes bewildering, in a war that seems, is very difficult to sort of wrap your head around. But I find a limitation I always confront is that that is one incredibly important story about the war, but it's not the story of the war. The war in Iraq really is about Iraq, about Iraqis, several thousand American soldiers died, and every single one of their stories is important, and the families that they left behind, and their pain is valuable, but it's no less valuable than the hundreds of thousands of Iraqi families or over 1 million maybe, whose lives were destroyed by the war. And that is a perspective that you just cannot get if you're embedded at all. And so it has been a goal of ours, Jeremy and myself, in these films to sort of show the other side of the war, which is the larger, in my opinion, the larger story about what this war is about. So it's not about being censored or being told what you can do or not do. It's just that where you stand when you're filming dictates everything. It's the perspective that you have. If you see the war filmed from the back of a tank rolling into Baghdad, you see a different war than you do if you see the war from a refugee camp on the outskirts of Sadr City where the tank is rolling through.
Great. I want to go to Sebastian next. Sebastian, you've done more war reporting than just Restrepo in this film. You've done print and other. So you're very experienced in the coverage of war. Have you done both embedded and non-embedded in your war coverage, or have you?
I mean, I don't mean to sort of quibble about definitions, but I think it's all embedded journalism. I mean, when I was in Sierra Leone during the Civil War, I was with the government fighters and depended on them for transportation and safety, and that's true of likewise in Bosnia and Kosovo. I mean, that's true in any war you're covering. If you're with the combatants, you're effectively embedded with them. Likewise, the fire department in New York City. I mean, that's what, in some sense, that's what journalism is. The term embedded now sort of means with the cooperation of the U.S. military. And I got to say, having covered civil wars all over the world, it was sort of a luxury because I did not have to worry at all about if I was going to be threatened or harmed by the people that I was with. And in wars, people get very, very paranoid, and you can be a journalist in the morning and suddenly accused of being a spy in the afternoon, and depending on who, and I've been accused of being a spy in Liberia, and it was absolutely terrifying. And so, like, to be with the U.S. military, even in enormous amounts of combat the way I was, felt like a pretty cushy ride.
Well, maybe by your standards. I want to follow up, though, on that, because I'm wondering, did you feel any difference? I mean, I hear you when you're saying making those distinctions can be semantic at times, but you did make a distinction there about being. So in Restrepo, it was with full cooperation, or well, cooperation at least. I mean, you wouldn't have been able to be there without that
Correct.
In that valley. So, did you perceive any danger, not physical danger, but any danger for you as a journalist by being in such close proximity to these soldiers for such an extended period of time and sort of really bonding with them in that way?
Well, again, every story I've been on, there's always the sort of human reaction of bonding with the people you're with. And I was in Sarajevo in '93, '94, and I'm sure that there was a sort of Serb side to the logic of the conflict, but that wasn't a side that I understood. In some ways, I didn't want to understand it. My sympathies were fully with the Bosnians. And when I went out to Restrepo, I mean, I was at an outpost about the size of this room, off and on for a year, and it was very exposed. I mean, my first day up there were 4 really full-on firefights. I mean, attacks right up into the wire, and that was just the first day. And it was clear that my safety, my emotional sense of well-being, my food, my transportation, I mean, everything came from the fact that I was in this group. And I had, I think, a very human experience, which is I affiliated with the group. And I allowed myself to do that because I really was not, I've done a little bit of investigative reporting, but that's not what I was doing there. I wasn't sort of investigating the U.S. military and the rights and wrongs of the war and the mistakes and whatever. I was really trying to understand what it feels like to be an American soldier in combat in Afghanistan. And I have a very sort of complex opinion about the war, but the soldiers really didn't. Like, their opinion about the war was that they wanted to get home alive.
Right.
That was pretty much it. And they really didn't discuss the politics of it. And I allowed myself, in a sense, to become subjective because the soldiers were subjective. And I was really trying to understand their experience. And I knew there were other great journalists out there who were giving the war a very hard look and probably doing a better job than I could have at sort of analyzing the politics of it, the geostrategy of it. It just wasn't the job I was doing. And so I kind of let myself go. And the result was a very intimate portrait of soldiers. It certainly was not an analysis of the war.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think that's a good lead into Kirby too, because Kirby, and you'll tell me if I got this wrong, but we've talked about some of these kinds of things. Kirby, it seems to me your work has, not that it's a one-way trip, but in recent years your work has become more investigative.
Yeah.
Right. This film is not yet rated. You investigated the rating system in Hollywood. Outrage, investing politics and issues of gay rights. And now this film, Invisible War, Rape in the Military. When you set out to do this film, did you feel like what you were doing was an investigative piece? And how is that, how do you perceive what you were doing? Have you seen, you've seen?
Yeah, I've seen Restrepo, yeah,
yes.
I've seen Rick's film, yeah.
How do you sort of perceive what you're trying to do vis-a-vis what these guys have talked about thus far?
Well, okay, so the first part of the question, yeah, absolutely, it was investigative, but it wasn't only that, because not only was I dealing with really the cover-up of this, this epidemic of rape in the U.S. military, but also I was very interested in the psychological experience of these men and women who'd been assaulted, and then when they, did have the courage to come forward and report the reprisals that they experienced and how that resulted in, just really devastated them. Most of them had very severe PTSD, and very few of them were able to work. And so it was not only their experience of the assault and what followed, but also their experience after that. I was very interested in that kind of psychological experience. How is it different? Well, certainly it's different. My film was done entirely in the U.S. It was, I mean, the only fear I ever had was, other than the first time going into the Pentagon, thinking, oh shit, here I am, then realizing that the generals in the Pentagon were, oh shit, there's an independent, filmmaker in here. It was sort of a very mutual fear, which is interesting. Was at one point, just sort of having somebody go on a base under a, pretending to be somebody else so I could get some footage, which our concern on that was, the Homeland Security laws are so vague but so broad that, actually one of my, I had a kind of a remote shooter sometime that followed one of my subjects onto the VA, and he was just sitting, and he was just sitting kind of outside waiting for her to come out, and two security came by and said, we can take you in. This is under Homeland Security. He somehow talked his way out of it. So, but nothing compared to what these two men have experienced. So, in that regard, it's very different.
But let me ask you this though. So, how aware was the Pentagon throughout the process of exactly what you were trying to do with this film and what you were investigating? Were you just completely upfront from the beginning?
No. No. I mean, in the last 4 films that I've done, including the one on clergy sexual abuse, I've tried not to let the institution that I'm looking into, know what I'm doing at all until as late as possible. With the Pentagon, we did ask to go in. We asked, we wanted their opinion on, to hear their perspective on what they were doing. They were not aware. We told them we were making a film on the subject, but we didn't tell them anything else. They weren't aware that we'd spoken to hundreds of survivors, they weren't aware of what our perspective was. We sort of approached it as if we were neutral in a way, which was absolutely not the case. And I don't think one can or should be neutral on this issue. And so, you know, after about 9 months of sort of...
But how do you even present the idea that you could be neutral without them going, what are you talking about?
Well,
you try to say that maybe this isn't as big a problem as people think
no,
it is?
No. The military's own estimates, the numbers are large, but the military, I mean, pre-2003, pre the Air Force Academy, there was a lot of attempt of just outright denial that this was a problem. That changed, you know, so that they admitted there was a problem. They just didn't. They just weren't undertaking any attempts to really deal with it. And the attempts they were kind of proud of and foregrounding. They were really very minimal. But so we went and we said, well, we want to hear those. Right. That's the approach. And again, you know, they weren't aware of anything else we were doing. And you know, I'm a little surprised that if they Googled me, I don't think, you know, I wouldn't let myself in. So, but you know, I mean, maybe that's a good sign, right? That the military is willing to let people in to interact. Although when I was in, I believe they said to me, "You're only the second independent documentary crew we've had in a decade," and I'm not sure why. I don't know. I mean, this is again coming from. I mean, in my experience pales in comparison to these two men, but it's.
You're a smooth talker.
My producer is.
Well, I want to lead into a clip we're going to show here in just a minute because I think, and then I want to get you guys to respond to this issue that. In talking to Kirby about his film some months ago, he told me about a part of the film that he had shot, cut, edited, everything, that you made a decision at one point to leave out of the film. Mm-hmm. I don't know, I haven't seen the clip. I don't know if you want to set it up in any way or just show it and then talk about it, or...
Well, yeah, I mean, this film was being made sort of with two audiences in mind. It was being made, you know, with a film audience, people who love film, but it was also really very much targeted at policymakers, a few hundred people in D.C. And because this is something that we knew if this film was made properly, it would have an impact on policy. We didn't expect it to have this incredible impact that it has had, but we knew that it would have impact. So and that was sometimes a challenge when we were cutting the film, and you know, when we were dealing scene by scene, we knew that if we cut it one way, this would really rouse audiences, it would make the film even maybe more popular, but policymakers would look at it and see it as either biased or anti-military. We were very careful. The film is not anti-military, even though it's a very strong critique of the military. So in these cases, we had to try to find a synthesis, something that worked for both audiences. And there's this one particular scene which is really about the misogyny in the military, which certainly exists. I mean, there's no question about that. But we elected not to put it in because
maybe show it first and then.
All right.
Can we do that? Show it first and then you tell us why you made that choice.
All right.
The military is a very patriarchal institution. For centuries, it's existed with simply men, and women have only played any kind of a role in the military in the past few decades. So you have an institution that is primarily male.
A man coming into a new unit in the military, the assumption is success until proven otherwise. For a woman, the assumption is failure until proven otherwise.
It's a very, very macho subculture, the military, and always has been since the beginning of time. Women are seen as sexual prey. They are talked about as sexual prey.
The corrosive nature of jokes in the workplace, of pictures, of pornography, of both subtle as well as very deliberate and explicit ways of putting women down. It's something that as women in the military, we don't like to talk about it much.
That pressure is very unlike the civilian workplace. In the civilian workplace, it's horrible, but you can legally quit your job without repercussion. You know, not so in the military. That added pressure creates what I call psychological torture.
You know, I mean, actually, we got my producer, who's, you know, was very much, I mean, she was the producer, I was the director, but it was very much a collaboration between us. We both took a film by credit. Was, you know, really wanted this scene in. I mean, she really loved it, and I, you know, I put it together, but then ultimately decided not to because I really wanted not only policymakers, but I knew that, you know, men in the military were going to watch this, and I did not want them to feel defensive. I did not want them to feel that the film was attacking men in any way, because I wanted them to focus on the fact that, you know, there was changes that had to be made in the military to you know, to put it, well, not put it in, but to certainly reduce rape, and so. And I felt that this would put people on the defensive. The film might be identified as feminist, which of course it is in some ways, or as liberal, and I really didn't want that. And so, I mean, this is a situation where I couldn't thread the needle. I couldn't keep the film in and achieve what I wanted to achieve in terms of reaching that, say, second audience of policymakers, and then, of course, you know, people within the military. And I think that proved very successful, because the military is now using the film as part of its sexual assault training, and at least a quarter of a million men and women have seen the film since it came out. So, but it was, anyway, so that was the decision that was made.
And first of all, I want to thank you for bringing it and showing this, because, you know, when we first talked about this, I thought this was it raises some really interesting questions about journalism versus activism in film. I want to put you guys on the spot. Have both of you seen Invisible War? Have you seen it? You have not? No. So if you feel like you can comment, at least from what you know of the film, I mean, I want you to put yourself in Kirby's shoes. Would you have put this scene in the movie? You won't mind me asking that, do you, Kirby?
No. Depends on what he says, though.
Well, no, given that incredibly lucid rationality he's just laid out, of course. You made the rational decision. No, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the logic you've laid out makes perfect and total sense. I mean, the film is intended, you know, not just to exist by itself as a sort of abstract piece of artwork, but to live in a world, in a media ecology where it does something. And so, honing that film down to a shape that can have the maximum impact is his job.
I mean, it's a complicated question. I think I might put it in, but I would probably also follow it with, if I put it in, I would follow it with a section where I interviewed young men in the military, and, you know, why they have, I mean, at Restrepo there was lots of sort of pin-up photographs of, you know, nude girls and stuff, and I'm not sure that reflects, I think that reflects on young men more than on the military per se, and I would probably talk to the young men about what it's like to be, you know, almost completely without women for a year at a time, and how they incorporate the idea of women into their minds as 20-year-olds, you know, whatever. I would try to have a conversation going about. Give
it a larger context.
Yeah.
Can I play devil's advocate? I wonder if maybe Amy made this argument, maybe not. Misogyny is at the heart of why rape is happening at such a large scale in the military. So how can you not possibly have this in the movie to help explain just why there's so much rape in the military? Is that a bullshit argument?
No, but I think it's mistaken. I think what's at the heart is that there are, you know, most men in the military are not rapists, right? It's a small minority of serial predators who assault again and again, and the military has been aware of this for decades and has not taken the steps to address it. And that is the point that I wanted to go after. And even now, the military, as a result, in large part because of this film, is doing a great deal about addressing this issue of misogyny, because with misogyny, what happens in an environment where there's a lot of sexual harassment, serial predators, it's much easier for them to operate. Mm-hmm. So in that regard, it does address the issue. But the more central issue, which is, you know, I think there in many ways broken criminal justice system around this, is still, I mean, they're still pushing back and not wanting to change it. So it's sort of the tip of the spear of this was to keep this focus on serial predators. Of course, that's the same in the civilian world too. Most rapes are caused by serial predators. But the military is in a kind of a unique position to address that in a way that civilians aren't. So that's, I mean, that was what kind of got me, the serial predator thing is what just kind of drives this thing all the way through. So once I start moving out into this discussion, which is really interesting, I mean, no question about it. I mean, you know, when there's no women in the workplace, then perhaps it's not misogynist. Of course, as soon as there's one woman and there's a pin-up, then it's, I mean, it could be misogynist anyway. I mean, this is an interesting discussion. But I didn't want to go wider because I didn't want to discuss the culture of the military so much as the sort of policy that has allowed, these, rapes to happen.
Do you think of yourself, and again, you've made lots of different kinds of films. Is this an activist film? Would you, if someone said this is a great activist film, Kirby, congratulations, would you say thank you?
Yeah, I would. I mean, I think just because the film's an activist film doesn't mean it's not a work of art.
Right.
I don't think, I mean, the idea, nor do I feel a film can be an activist, it can be journalist, it can be a work of art. In fact, I think there's a lot of similarities between those. I mean, people tend to make those distinctions. I actually think those three groups of people work in very similar ways. They're very committed, they don't get paid a lot, they work very hard, they pretty much work under their own direction. And so, I feel very aligned, and the more, I mean, the last 4 films I've made, I've had journalists in, and I've worked very closely with them, and every time I work with a journalist, I'm actually more and more impressed by their training, their commitment. I mean, I'm continually learning from them how to, make my art, actually.
I wanted I want you to. What's your feeling about the question of journalists and activists, journalists versus activists?
I think they're both. I think both journalism and activism are really important and necessary. I think they're really different things. And for me, as a journalist, journalists have opinions, strong opinions about things, just like everyone does. But you really have to enter your topic with an open mind. And you really have to police yourself to not exclude information that you might turn up that is contrary to your assumptions. In other words, you have to be prepared to defend the person you think you're attacking, if the information warrants it. And I think with activism, there's a very, you've decided beforehand, and again, this is a valid thing to do, I just think it's not journalism, you've decided beforehand that there is a good you want to create in the world, and you set out to do it. And you can, both on the left and the right. On the right, it might be a pro-life activist. They just don't want abortion to happen. And it's a completely valid thing to try to make happen in the world. But that person is not, I don't think they're ethically responsible to bring in information that undermines their goal. And with journalists, you absolutely ethically have to do that.
Yeah, I think it's hard for me to disentangle the motivation behind, and to sort of even think of what it would mean to say, an activist film or a piece of activist journalism versus a piece of whatever. I mean, what motivates, people are motivated to go and take the risks that they take and cover the things that they cover because of a passionate conviction of one kind or another. Otherwise, the risks just don't make any sense. I mean, I started covering the Iraq War because I believe that it was a hugely important thing that our country was doing that wasn't being reported in a way that I thought was responsible, and that there weren't people, there was almost no unembedded coverage of the war. There was almost no coverage of the civilian toll of the war. I mean, the war we saw was narrated to us by generals and was filmed from the noses of bombs. And that the journalists who I respect the most, the journalists whose work I think is amazing, are motivated by a passionate desire to tell the truth, to make visible, things that are invisible. And that is not, being committed to the true and the real and to being honest and being intellectually honest about things is not something that, it's something that we should demand of everyone, of activists or anyone. And I think that's at the core of what we do. Like, Dirty Wars is the global war on terror is the most important story of our generation. It's the longest war our country's ever fought. It's killed hundreds of thousands of people, thousands of American soldiers, and it's being fought, almost entirely in secret. 72 countries, 100 countries that JSOC is operating in now, and not just on battlefields that we know about in Afghanistan and Iraq, but in Yemen, in the Horn of Africa, all across Africa now. These cluster of wars that are part of this war are things that are systematically hidden from us. So our commitment to in making this film was an attempt to take that war that is being fought in our name, but without our knowledge and without effective congressional oversight, and bring it into the public discourse. And that is a motivation that you could call an activist motivation, but it didn't make us dishonest. I mean, it was the core of our desire to be honest, to tell the truth about the things that we see in the world.
Now, in your film, you know, as I said earlier, it follows this journalist, Jeremy, who is, you know, is trying to uncover the truth about these covert operations. In your film, is the responsibility to journalism more his or yours? You know what I'm asking? I mean, you're following a journalist doing his work.
Yeah. So am I making
filmmaker.
an artistic film about a journalist, and the journalist is passionately committed to the truth, but I can take liberties that are...
Well, because your film, because one of the things I think that's very distinctive about Rick's film is, I don't know, you know, you got to go see these films, but it is, I mean, it's like, it's a thriller, and I mean, down to, you know, adopting some of the stylistic conventions of fictional narrative film. You know, when he introduces characters, it's like a still, a black and white still, and the name types on the screen. There's, you know, suggestions of surveillance photography of characters. You know, so it's a very gripping, beautifully shot, which is not to say that, you know, you can't do all these things in a more traditional documentary way. But this film is a very, you know, it's a very different kind of approach and treatment of what has normally been investigative journalism.
Yeah, well, we wanted to. I mean, one of the things that always is a massive challenge is making these people and these stories real and palpable to audiences in America. I mean, like the family in Gardez. We visited a family in Afghanistan who half of their family was killed in a U.S. night raid. But, you know, they have beards and strange clothes, and they speak a language none of us understand, and they're in rural Afghanistan in the middle of nowhere. And to make those stories resonate and those people feel human, I mean, we needed a narrative arc that could take you through all these places, that could take you and weave together the stories of Afghanistan, Somalia, Yemen, and a broader war into something that felt coherent, you know? So fiction film, narrative film, documentaries, I mean, that one of the things that it's amazing at is allowing people to feel those kinds of identifications. And that the arc and the structure of narrative film it's seductive and it's amazing and it's beautiful, and it is one thing that we wanted the film to feel like that, to take you on a journey to these places and to allow you, through Jeremy, to experience a human connection to people who you're cut off from by massive cultural and geographic distances. So while remaining, you know, passionately committed to the factual and the true, and I mean, Jeremy was writing a book parallel to this film, and it is meticulously reported. It's like a 700-page book with, you know, 50 pages of footnotes and multiple legal vetting, whatever. It's meticulous. He is meticulous in his reporting, and the film is meticulous in its approach to details and facts. But yet, so while maintaining that, having an arc that can make audiences feel the story and make it real to them was what we were trying to do.
Sebastian, do you feel, do you watch a lot of documentaries? I mean, are you a fan of the form?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could see more, but...
Yeah, all like us all. I just wonder, do you have feelings about where it's going in terms of some of these issues of journalism versus activism? Do you feel like there's too much activism in documentary and not enough journalism, or that filmmakers, because you were trained, I assume you came up as a print journalist, right? With all of the sort of rigor of that discipline, and then moved into film. And I'm wondering if you feel like there's a lot, I mean, because I didn't have that training and got into documentary. Do you feel like there's a lot of documentary filmmakers out there that need a bit more journalism in their approach? And
I mean, I think if they want to call their work journalism, they do. Mm-hmm. But I don't think any of them are under the obligation to be producing journalism. I mean, I think it's perfectly valid to make a beautiful film that has a point of view that you want to communicate. And I mean, that's totally fine. It's just not but by the strictest definition of journalism, it's not journalism. But there's room for it in the sort of media pie. But I think we all have to be. I mean, Fox News is not journalism. You know, I mean, just as an example, on the right wing, you know, like they have a point of view they want you to believe, and they will, in my opinion, they will ignore certain facts and distort others in order to get you to think a certain way. Totally fine. You know, it's just not journalism, it's editorial. And so I think in the minds of filmmakers, some thought has to be given to what it is you're trying to be. And they're both valid, but they can't ever coexist. It's sort of one or the other.
What's your feeling, Kirby?
I don't find those strict definitions existing anywhere in life. I mean, I want to say, I mean, I so respect the rigor of journalists, and I've really learned from it. And one of the fascinating things is because, you know, there's, you know, documentary and journalism is, you know, very close to each other, yet documentary, you know, there's no codified, you know, ethics or standards. I mean, it's, you know, it's just the Wild West, really. And I understand why, from a journalist's perspective, that can be, what the fuck? I mean, and sometimes, you know, I mean, I'm looking at other people and saying, what the fuck, from that, you know, perspective.
Because you were trained as an art student. You were an art student, right?
Right.
You didn't do any of that journalism thing.
Yeah, I mean, initially when I got into film, I was like, oh, journalists, you know, they're just so narrow-minded. But as I got into it, it's actually, you know, you appreciate the beauty of the rigor of that. So, but I don't think, I mean, I think there's a gray scale to begin with. So you know, the question of whether one can be one and not the other, I mean, in my mind, there's no bright line. But I do think one point you made that was interesting is that you have to be prepared to argue the opposite position. That, you know, that's very interesting. I mean, I would say there's many pieces of journalism that may, you know, ostensibly, I mean, claim to do that, but actually don't, because there's a position that I see that's very opposite to what they're seeing that's not getting argued at all. The truly opposite position is not getting argued at all. Yet, I would not say that that's not journalism. On the other hand, I mean, just to take the other side of this argument, when I'm making this film, I mean, I'm trying to, you know, I do not like to put in anything that's not factual. I mean, that drives me crazy. And, you know, it's funny, my producer, you know, is just always exaggerates when she speaks. And, I mean, she's a great producer. She's fantastic. I mean, I don't want to say that. But she just is so passionate. And so we've had this agreement that when it comes to statistics, I say the statistics. Because I hate it when it's wrong. I was on a panel with some senators who are fantastic. And then they just, because for whatever reason, you know, they were just getting into this. I mean, the statistics that they were saying were so astonishing. I was like, and you can't interrupt a senator saying, no, sir, that's not right. But anyway, I don't, you know, I understand that perspective, and sometimes I'm very interested in the fact of looking at it from the other side, and I really do think it through, but I don't think it's, if I don't articulate that, it's necessarily not journalism. Even though I also respect someone's rigor to insist on that as well. I mean, it's you know, I don't think that's a negative thing. I don't think one is obligated as a journalist to do it.
But there's also different forms of journalism, just as there are different sort of forms of documentary. I mean, in the print world, I mean, there's a vast difference between being an AP stringer who writes the, like, you know, whatever, writes wire copy and just churns out 5 sentences that describe what happened in Yemen today, like constantly, and writing, you know, features, like a feature piece that's like multi-page in a newspaper, or a book, or a, you know, a nonfiction narrative book that evolves over hundreds of pages and will have a story that curves through it. Or on the TV side, there's a vast difference. I mean, and all of that is journalism. All of that is, you know, has the same sort of sets of standards, but formally is totally different in its construct. Television too. I mean, there's a vast difference between being doing, you know, 3 minutes on the nightly news every night, to doing a half-hour news magazine piece, to doing a, you know, a feature film. Like, I mean, they're all part of the same sort of category. It's like all the, you know, there's not one sort of style or structure.
Well, and I think you were sort of saying this, Kirby, too. there's also that issue which of what is the sort of political umbrella, if you will, you've got your Fox News, you've got MSN or MSC, whatever it is, the liberal version of Fox. And then you've got people who say this is all basically a capitalist view of the issue. You know, there's all kinds of other ways you could look at this issue that have nothing to do with what we define as right and left, right? That our right and left is a very narrow part of the spectrum of the ways in which you could look at this. I want to just ask one more question, then we'll open it up to you guys. I'm sure you guys have questions. Forgive me for not getting to you earlier, but I just wonder, we started with this thing about military and talking about embedding and non-embedding, and I wonder, embedding began with Afghanistan or Iraq? The military saying, okay, we're going to let, does anyone know for sure?
Iraq, I think.
Iraq. Yeah. So I'm just wondering, with all three of you guys, just to quickly weigh on this, do you think that the military, how do you think the military has been served or not served by that decision? How have we, you know, the world, the people who, you know, the greater public been served or not served by that position? And I know that's a lot to ask, but, you know, brief answers and we'll get to these questions. Do you want to start again?
It's been amazing for the military. I mean, it allows the military to have access to local broadcasters across like the entire country, rather than just one or two sort of points of access. It, you know, I mean, local television stations can do features on their National Guard from their like local county, and it's amazing the sort of number of eyeballs that get on this stuff. But it's also,
and that's good for recruiting.
It's good for
public image.
They have. I mean, it's kind of like the coverage is, there's never been more cameras kind of on a war than there were during the Iraq invasion, but it's like a mile wide and an inch deep, right? I mean, you have a whole bunch of reporters who are given, you know, who are all managed by PAOs in different ways, who are somehow times more or less in control of the sort of situation, but that are showing, I mean, you just inevitably, being with the troops, you're showing, you know, an image of from the perspective of the soldiers who are going in. I mean, sometimes the war escapes you, it escapes your ability to control it, and like, I mean, Restrepo is not a recruiting film. I don't imagine. But for us, it's become increasingly difficult to operate like outside of that. I mean, and I don't mean by embedding with insurgents or embedding with militias, but by being with civilians who are on the other side of the war. I mean, we're the images that we see of war are from the perspective of American soldiers.
I want to go to Sebastian next, but before, something you just said, you don't think Restrepo is a recruiting film, and I don't think so either, but in a weird sort of way, in my own experience with films I've done that not war film, well, I imagine there were a lot of young men that may have seen Restrepo and said, fuck, man, I'd like to be a soldier. Maybe? No? What do you think?
Yeah, tremendously. I mean, I just keep running into young guys at readings who have said exactly that. I saw Restrepo and made me want to join. I mean, you know, these are guys who were at age 8 were playing war in their backyard, and their dad was in Vietnam, and they, you know, I mean, a lot of these guys come from sort of military families where that's what men do.
What do you say when they say that?
I say, I'm glad the film affected you. I mean, and I am. And there are other people who told far fewer, and maybe that's just young men being young men. But some also said, I saw Restrepo and made me realize I don't want to have anything to do with war. And they're both totally valid points of view. The interesting thing about Restrepo was that that sort of, for lack of a better word, the right wing thought the film represented their feelings about the war, and so did the left wing. I mean, they both sides sort of felt it spoke to that for them. It was really interesting.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. I mean, and is that for you? Is that a point of pride?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, war is really complicated, and you really can't pigeonhole it. I mean, in my experience, you can't. It's my experience in war has changed me in tremendously good ways. And I watched it change the young men I was with at Restrepo in incredibly good ways. And it's also very traumatizing. I mean, it's just sort of, it's like trying to characterize marriage or something. It's like, it really is, it's everything. It's hard, it's great, it's like, it's everything. And we really tried to capture that. I mean, just as a kind of footnote, the military uses Restrepo in, like, they show it to soldiers in boot camp, and like they actually use the film pretty actively. In my book War, which sort of accompanies the movie, they use it, and they use it because, well, I spoke at West Point once, and a young man came up to me and said, "We've read a lot of books and seen a lot of movies, but your work is the only work that told us how we were going to feel when we got there." And I think the military understands that that sort of component of how this is going to feel is potentially very confusing. And if you can sort of start to talk about those feelings beforehand, it's tremendously beneficial to the soldiers. If you're scared, if you feel guilty, if you're excited, for that matter, by combat, all those things, that soldiers are very confused by those feelings. And if they realize that they're quite common, it's quite reassuring.
Before I go to Kirby, I just want to ask one more thing. So, and you said this earlier, that the focus of Restrepo is, it's a deep film, but it's narrow in focus, right? You're not trying to analyze whether we should be there or not, the politics of this war. I don't know your view of that war you were covering. Did it ever give you pause that the military and that it was so embraced across the spectrum? And did that ever come in conflict with your own personal feelings about that war?
Not really. I mean, I should just say quickly, just to sort of address something you said earlier, journalists have almost always been embedded with soldiers. Civil War, World War I, World War II, Vietnam. The exception was Gulf War I. Mm-hmm. And that, I think the whole journalistic community was appalled that they were being kept out of something that was that huge in our affairs, American affairs. And for me, God, this is sort of a longer conversation, but I was in Kabul in 2001. I was in Afghanistan in 2000 with Massoud, and I almost got killed in a Taliban rocket bombardment. I was with Massoud's forces when they took Kabul in 2001, and it was a profound experience. I was walking around Kabul, and it was just a big citywide celebration, and people were coming up to me and hugging me because I was American, and they were thanking me for what our country did to liberate them from the Taliban. It was a very, very powerful experience. And we completely squandered that goodwill. But I saw Afghanistan in the mid-90s and in 2000, and I see what it looks like now, the level of development and the relatively low level of civilian casualties compared to the Civil War in the 90s. And I'm filled with criticisms of how the war was prosecuted, but I also see a country that's way better off right now than it was in the 90s. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean we need to stay there forever. I'm not arguing for anything. I'm just saying, like, in my experience with that country, this is so much better than it was. And, I hope that's enough of an answer.
Yeah, that is. I'd love to talk more about it. But has the way in which this war embedded or not, however you want to, the way in which Afghanistan and Iraq has been captured by filmmakers, by journalists, do you think it's served the military?
Well, it seems to have. I mean, I was interested in a comment that you made that the experience of war is good and bad. I mean, and I think that's true. I mean, I think that the experience of being in the military, there's so much that's positive about it that I think a lot of civilians don't understand. But I think when the impact of war in general, is hugely negative. I mean, it's so destructive, and even if it's better for Afghanistan, which I think is open to debate, but you obviously have seen much more than I have, so I don't want to take issue with that. For this country, in many ways, it's been really bad, and for the world, in a lot of ways, it's been bad. So this is one of the broader issues that, I think oftentimes, and I don't think it's journalists per se, but the media as a whole in its presentation doesn't address, is that in some ways there's nothing worse than war. And I think we always have to keep that in mind. That is always, it is always causes just untold trauma, any war. And anyway, I don't want to go too far.
And it's interesting because some of it, it's almost like if you had been embedded in Iraq with a group of soldiers in a very dangerous place, and let's say, I'm not saying you do, but let's say you felt like we had no business at all in Iraq, right? That was just a complete mistake. You might still have come out with a film that's as powerful and had the same effect on people watching it because it's narrow in focus. So you bond with these men and what they go through. And I could just see, it is a complicated question, right?
You asking me?
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm supposed to go to you guys for questions, but let me just answer this and then we'll get to questions. You can raise your hand and they'll take a mic. Get mics to people because we're going to want you to speak into the mic so that they capture it.
Yeah, one of the questions I was trying to answer in my book more than in the film was why the guys I was with, they had huge casualty rates. It was incredibly hard, traumatizing deployment, and I would say most of those guys missed it. They wanted to be back there.
Right.
They're not psychopathic killers. That's not what they missed. They missed the human connection that occurs in a small group in an extreme situation. So they come home, and they know that war is awful, right? Of course, everyone knows that, it's obvious. And they know how it's traumatized them because they're experiencing the trauma in nightmares and PTSD and all that. And they're very confused by why they would miss something that's so awful. And that's what I mean by war sort of contains everything. And that's what I've been trying to sort out in my work, is how do those different things it contains, how do they affect each other?
And your film, the one that's playing here, ruminates on this in some very, I think, really profound ways. So we'll go to questions.
First of all, I just want to say thanks. All you guys' films I really appreciate about giving a different light of what's going on. So the topic of this panel, military secrets. And part of that to me means the military's got their own media and they're trying to control the narrative. So it feels like to find other stories, it takes people like you guys to be able to do that. Initially, how do you get in the door when they don't want you to? And it seems ironic that now they're using some of your films for training. And so my question there is just, there are other stories to be told, like about the military doesn't want told, about suicide or drones. So I'm just kind of curious, how do you get past...
Are you asking for how they get cooperation to tell those difficult stories, or can you just tell them without the cooperation of the military?
Well, I think you need access, so I think you need some sort of permission. And
do you? That's a good question. So,
our film could only be made by leaving the military, by disembedding ourselves and filming outside of any military sanctioned location. we had to travel around unembedded in rural Afghanistan and Yemen and Somalia. In Somalia, we were embedded in a way, as Sebastian says, with American-backed warlords. But in Yemen and Afghanistan, you have to take a huge set of personal risks to get out there. To say something that is sort of an exaggeration, just to kind of be provocative, war is not about soldiers. Soldiers are not the people who die in war. Soldiers do die in war, but a tiny fraction of the number of people who are killed in war. From World War II on, every single war, there's the ratio of civilian deaths to combatant deaths in wars that are fought by first world militaries has just increased sort of steadily. And in Iraq, it was just mind-blowing, the discrepancy in that. And so the whole sort of ocean of pain and suffering and trauma that was, for example, the Iraq War, the experience of American soldiers is important and valuable, and all those lives matter, but it's a drop in that. So to tell the stories of the people, of the vast majority of the people who are experiencing the war, is to leave the U.S. military and to film outside of its zone of control.
And one of the key sources in the film is an ex-special ops guy who you never see his identity. That's one way that you guys...
Oh, yeah. So in terms of getting access, Jeremy Scahill, the journalist who's followed in the film, is an amazing investigative reporter who broke lots of stories about mercenary companies and
the Blackwater scandal.
The Blackwater, I
call it a scandal.
Yeah, definitely. And he's cultivated relationships with people inside who want to blow the whistle on this sorts of things.
Does anybody want to add anything to that, or move on to the next question? Next question. Okay. Or whoever's got the mic gets to talk. Uh-oh. I think they want you to have the mic because they're... Okay, go ahead.
Mr. Dick, I'm more intrigued with the top-down than I am the bottom-up, and I come from the perspective of the military manual, information operations, and trying to control the narrative. The idea is pretty simple. You show as much as you can at the lowest level. The fog of war. So my question for you is, what kinds of experiences did you have from the top down in terms of access, and did you ever feel anybody was trying to control your narrative?
I think they felt that by making them accessible, that themselves accessible, that of course, I mean, this is every institution. This is not unique to the military. If there's a film being made about something, wants to control it in some way, and I think they made the decision that by making themselves accessible, that would allow them to get their point of view in, and therefore control the narrative. What I was surprised at in my situation was the lack of knowledge and the lack of understanding of the issue, which was extremely profound. I mean, in the person who was at the head, a two-star general, who was at the head of SAPRO, which oversaw, dealing with sexual assault in the military, had never spoken with a survivor. And you cannot understand this issue without speaking to a survivor. And in fact, I think that's what how the film has changed so much, is put these people's voices forward. So, yeah, I mean, in this particular case, it was shocking.
Another question?
This is for Mr. Junger, and it may not be a fair question to ask, but based on your experience in Afghanistan, what's your gut feel about the likelihood that we can keep the Taliban from coming to power once the United States withdraws?
That's a good question, and I don't know, obviously. My guess is they're going to leave enough forces there to keep Kabul from falling. They also, I mean, there's other concerns. Obviously the basis for this war was Al-Qaeda. And we got to Afghanistan and Al-Qaeda fled into Pakistan, and they've been pretty decimated. But obviously they're still in Pakistan. I think the administration probably does want some kind of platform in Afghanistan to at least monitor their activity. There's also nukes in Pakistan that I think a lot of people are reasonably extremely worried about. It's a very unstable country, and my guess is that they have teams, the U.S. has teams in Afghanistan that are sort of poised to insert into Pakistan to safeguard those nukes if there's a real civil collapse in Pakistan. I mean, I'm just guessing. I don't know. I'm just guessing. So I think they will, I think they won't let Kabul fall. Whatever that might take, I think they won't let Kabul fall. I think the people of Kabul are probably quite happy about that. I mean, when I was there, as I said, in 2001, they were incredibly happy to be rid of the Taliban. I don't think they want them back. The war really, for the most part, the war that's happening now, it's not all of the Afghan ethnic groups, it really is the Pashtuns. It really is a war involving Pashtun fighters from both sides of the Pakistani-Afghan border. And one of the things that might happen, the Pashtun fighters have a harder time operating in Hazara territory, whom they massacred in the 90s, in Uzbek territory, than they do in Pashtun areas. And so what might happen is that the country kind of stabilizes along ethnic lines, with the southern third or 40% or so being a Pashtun-controlled area, and the rest of it being basically in sort of nominal government control. But I'm totally guessing here.
Sounds good, though.
It sounds good.
That's good analysis.
Impressed me.
Yes.
Mr. Dick, I saw a screening of your film back in January. Right here, sir. Okay. Yes. And suffice to say, I didn't see that scene, and clearly you explained why. But it just dawned on me that most of the interviews that were taken were, of course, the female victims, their boyfriends, husbands, and also the upper echelon of senior officers. But I didn't see the perspective of the grunts, the guys who, I guess, are proponents of this hyper masculine bravado, culture that is the American military. Did you take interviews from, I guess, that perspective?
No, and again, yes, it's you could say there's a bravado, a hyper masculinity. I don't think that necessarily means that leads to an assault on your fellow soldiers, be they men or women, because more men than women are sexually assaulted in the military each year. And again, that's why I want to make this distinction. Yes, we might have really type A type of men and women in the military as well, but that is not and that could, affect this issue of misogyny, but that is not the primary reason why this is happening. That's what I keep trying to go back to. It's not, even though, addressing the culture is important, and even though perhaps it's more of a challenge in the military to deal with this in the civilian world, they also have more tools, by the way. And they have, in some ways, a better track record of dealing with other issues like integration. But so again, I felt that if I focus on the culture, I don't get to the central point. And this central point is the point that really, I think, can flip things.
Question?
Do you think that the Overton window is shifting to the point where the mainstream media aren't going along as much with what the press secretaries are wanting them to say?
Is that addressed to anybody in particular, or just anyone? Anyone up here? You want? Yeah, whoever wants to take a crack at that.
Just in my experience, I would meet a public affairs officer at Bagram Air Base on my way out to the Korangal Valley, to Restrepo, and I would get my papers from them. And being embedded, it's about as hard as applying for a credit card. It's really simple. If you're working for a media outlet, you have to have a press pass or whatever, and it's really, really simple. And I would say hello and goodbye to the public affairs officer and wouldn't see him again for a month on my way back in. So I was never, ever shepherded by anyone from public affairs. And for that matter, just to say, I know other journalists have had very different experiences, but for me personally, Tim and I were shooting a lot of very upsetting stuff. So Afghan civilian casualties from American bombings, American casualties, really upsetting stuff. Guys in firefights, bare-chested, like sort of Vietnam style. It was like totally outside of protocol out there. And nobody ever once even suggested that we might want to, leave certain things out. I was really very relieved and impressed by that.
And, I just want to say that this is one of the things that really struck me about your film was that there really isn't, maybe you know more, but there isn't really extended imagery of our troops in Afghanistan. It was kind of shocking to me to see an hour and a half of this footage, whereas when you look at Vietnam, and I've cut films using B-roll, and it's just all over the place of people, and I just thought, oh my God, I haven't seen this footage at all until I saw yours. So I mean, I don't know why other embedded filmmakers aren't doing these more extended pieces, are they? I mean,
there have been a couple, but I mean, Restrepo was the first that really got that sort of gritty, intimate, like over a long period of time portrait. I mean, there's Armadillo. I mean, I don't know what other films.
Yeah, Operation whatever it was. I mean, but in really highly dangerous setting. I think that's one of the things that really distinct. You know, you were right there where it doesn't get any worse, it didn't get any tougher.
And in the clip that we showed, I mean, Tim was saying that the sort of military command kind of forgot that we were there, which might be true. I mean, Tim and I we each did 5 one-month trips, sometimes together, sometimes apart. We covered a lot of territory with this platoon. The platoon's 30 men. The command might have forgotten we were there, but Captain Kearney certainly didn't, because we saw him every week. You know, the lieutenant saw us every day. I mean, they knew we were there, and they were okay with it. And I think they understood that what we were trying to do is show what it's like for them. Period. End of sentence. And they were good with it. And they knew that what we would show would be way outside of protocol. I mean, they got it. You know, and they were, if anything, they were kind of proud of that.
One of the things go ahead.
I just wanted to say, just on the embedded question, my only experience was when I was in the Pentagon. I was the PR person proudly took me around and showed me where the anchors for CNN and all the networks, they have their offices inside the Pentagon, and they were very proud of that. And I was somewhat horrified, because it raised the question, to me at least, how could you report from the Pentagon when the very people you're working beside you're going to be critical of? And so that, at the same time, maybe it's good that they're in there, I don't know, but it does raise the question of perhaps this is one of the reasons the mainstream media is unable to really have a very strong critique, especially, you know, anchors, because they work beside these people every day.
Right. Yeah, and those contacts are precious too.
Right.
To maintain.
Yes. Yeah.
We can do one more, and then we'll wrap up.
Did you have?
You want it on the microphone? I think because they're recording it, they need you to.
Sebastian, did you have difficulty separating after bonding with the group that you were filming?
Yeah, I had great difficulty. I mean, I missed it like they did, and I've never been closer to a group of people. I mean, I was never particularly a joiner, like I was a long-distance runner in high school, things like that. So it's not like I was on the football team, but no, it was a really profound experience. And to be part of a group like that, in a group where the stakes were so high, and where they depended on me to not be a problem and endanger people, and I depended on them to essentially to protect me. And I still miss. I mean, I stopped war reporting after Tim got killed. I just made the decision within a few hours. Like, no more war reporting, I'm done. I'm 51, 10 years ago, I would not have made that decision. But at 50, you know, it's like, it just felt like it was time. But it was one of the most profound experiences of my life, and I really do miss it. Yeah.
We have to wrap it up. I want to say just a couple words about each of the films to encourage you to go see it. As I was saying earlier, you know, Rick's film is an investigative piece of journalism, but it's not like any investigative documentary I've seen. It really sort of blends some very different styles while being this very, very hardcore look and critical film, ultimately, of the Obama administration, which I know may horrify some of us here. But Kirby's film, you know, is just, it's one of the more powerful, I think, and emotional investigative pieces that you're going to see on any topic. And Sebastian's film which is really, you know, remembering Tim Heatherton and coming to understand who he is quite moving and poignant. And I was saying to him before the panel, if you're a budding filmmaker or just successful filmmaker or want to make documentaries, there's one added, I think, real benefit to seeing Sebastian's film, because in describing the way Tim approached telling stories and photographing stories, I think there's a lot of lessons there about how to do this kind of work in a way that you can still feel, you can sleep at night and feel good about what you're doing. I mean, he was really pretty extraordinary guy and had a lot of insight, you know, into that, and Sebastian's film really, I think, captures that. So thank you guys for doing this panel.
Thank you.